All right, who wants to trash talk another pioneer in psychology? I really want to, especially since this is the third time I'm recording this. TikTok apparently does not want me to make this video. One time it just cut off after a few minutes for no reason. Next time it recorded it without sound. And the next time there was just blankness in the middle for some reason. And I just can't help myself. I'm going to keep trying. So let's talk about this guy. This is Harlow. What have you heard about Harlow, if anything? I don't have the resident teenager to ask, but if you have taken an introductory psychology, child development class, perhaps, you might have heard about his famous monkey love studies. If you've never heard of the monkey love studies, get your mind out of the gutter. It's not that. Why were you thinking that? So his most famous studies are relevant to the field of attachment. You know, that attachment in humans, bonding in animals, that relationship, that link between a caregiver and their offspring. And at the time, in the 20th century, roughly middle of the 20th century, where Harlow is doing a lot of his influential work, the dominant idea, the dominant school of thought in psychology was behaviorism. Now, we have already talked about a pretty central figure in behaviorism. That would be this guy, John Brodus Watson. And so Watson and other behaviorists, when they talked about pretty much explaining anything in human behavior, they would focus on what's going on in the environment. They didn't want to talk about, anything going on internally. Or in fact, they had this idea of the black box, like anything that happens in the person themselves, we can't study that objectively. It's black box, we don't care. But what happens in the environment? And so with what we would call attachment behaviors, they would explain it in terms of, well, that caregiver feeds you. You have associated them with food. You've been reinforced for spending time with them by being fed. So the caregiver is associated with food. Food explains any kind of attachment behaviors. Watson himself was very dismissive of his own wife's inclination to, do things like pick up the children and hug them and snuggle them. It's like, no, that serves no purpose. All right. So that was the dominant idea at the time. And so one thing in particular got Harlow thinking that maybe food couldn't explain everything about what we would call attachment behaviors, because he is working with orphaned infant monkeys reared in isolation. He separated them from their mothers at birth. Would that be considered unethical? Many people would say yes. All right. Was he allowed to do it? Yes, it was allowed. And a lot of people do object to what the monkeys had to go through in many of his studies. All right. And so he was rearing them in isolation, and it turned out to be difficult because they seemed to have this inner drive to seek out contact with others. So they would try to communicate through their cages at other monkeys in the lab, people walking by. And so they tried to cover the cages in cloth diaper material. And the thing is, they would rip it down. They're like, you can't do this to me. But also, they would snuggle the cloth diaper material. They would find them, doing little cuddle behaviors. And, you can't explain that. How do you explain that with dominant behavioral theory? He couldn't. And so he says, well, maybe there's something else about attachment behaviors. And so he developed this study, and first he had to develop this surrogate mother, fake monkey mothers. And at first there was just one. And so it has the little fake, roughly monkey-like face, and it is covered in soft material, and it had a bottle coming out of the chest. So food and what he eventually called contact comfort. But then the really famous studies are where he said, well, what if they had a choice between food and contact comfort? What would they pick? So you have a wire mother that had, there's no bottle in the picture, I think, but the wire mother had a bottle coming out of their chest, so they had food. Cloth mother had no bottle, but was, much more fun to cuddle than a wire mother. The monkeys chose to spend time with the cloth mother far more often. They would spend up to 22 hours a day clinging to the cloth mother. They would only go to the wire mother when they were really, really hungry, and they were forced to go over there. We also see that when they would show this scary toy, this is a still picture, but it would move around, and in video of this, you can see the monkeys just dart away. They're terrified of this thing. They would go to the cloth mother for what seems like for comfort. Now, what happens to these monkeys? We've established that contact comfort seems to be important to what we would call attachment behaviors. But what about the monkeys in his studies? What happened to the monkeys in their studies? Once the study's done, can they go off and be monkeys and be fine? No. These monkeys show a lot of fear and anxiety. They could not figure out how to interact with other monkeys. They definitely could not figure out how to mate. They had lifelong problems. Here you can see one of the monkeys cowering in a corner at this cootie bug toy. I'm old enough to remember the cootie bug. It's a toy that can look, looks like an insect, can be frightening, and he is just cowering in the corner. And so the monkeys in the study, a lot of people object to what they had to go through for these results. In particular, one series of studies that is often not included in psychology textbooks because it didn't give us those interesting, meaningful results that we got from the monkey love studies. We have these studies that were meant to be about depression. Harlow, from his own experiences with depression, wanted to do some studies that were relevant to depression. And we do have some very relevant, interesting, applicable studies, animal studies of depression out there. But for this one, what he did is he had this device that he named the pit of despair. And many people are like, what kind of insensitive person names it the pit of despair? But that's what he called it. And so the monkeys in his studies, they were put into this pit where you can't get out of it. Essentially, it has these high walls, and so essentially they are trapped. They can't get out. They are isolated. They can't get out. And so what happened to them as a result? When they finally got out after a few weeks, when they got out of the pit of despair, he described it as if they had been broken. Okay, so what do we do with that? What do we do with that result? This set of studies is seen as especially cruel, because they had lost their vigor. They had lost their drive from going through this experience, but it didn't really help us understand depression more. It didn't lead to anything, for treatment or anything like that. So there's definitely that, excuse me, there's definitely that criticism of, you tortured some monkeys. Congratulations. What else can we say about Harry Harlow? Let's talk about his wives. So he was married 3 times to 2 people. Wait, what? How does that work? All right. So first of all, first wife, she was his student. That's never okay. Was it more okay then? Well, you couldn't get in trouble for it then. Sometimes people do. But anyway, not only was she his student, he was in a position of power over her. She also didn't get to have a career once she was married. She just had to raise his children. And he neglected her. He lived in the laboratory. Yeah, definitely problematic. Now, what about his second wife? All right. So once Clara, his first wife, gets fed up and leaves him, immediately he marries another psychologist. All right. Again, he gets to be famous and successful, and she has to be his wife. And interestingly, when people from the lab would come over and visit them at home, they were horrified at the dust climbing up the furniture. And it's like, she has a full-time job as a scientist. But I guess at the time, you're supposed to be a wife. You're supposed to clean up. Now, so Margaret, she died of cancer. Within the year of her passing away, he remarries Clara. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that a little weird? His kids describe him as very distant, very cold. It's interesting that he's known for contributing to our understanding of attachment, and he seemed to have very lacking attachment relationships with all of his children. He lived at the laboratory. He was not warm, not affectionate, not a lot of contact comfort from him. So those are some of the criticisms of Harry Harlow.